Max Verstappen's driving has been back in the spotlight, and we have been on the front lines on this channel. Thank you for watching.
Hmm.
But if you read social media, it sounds like if you don't like how Max drives, how can you like how Senna drives? How can you like how Schumacher drives? You cannot be their fans. How true is that, though? Is Max Verstappen, in fact, just the latest in the long line of Senna like drivers? We are going to have a little look. Here we go. So, Ammar, this has been going round and round on social media ever since Austin and Mexico, and there's been a kind of thought that Max is like the latest, the grandson of the of Senna Schumacher, that style of driving. And I think we've talked about this previously on the channel before, that I think there's two like main archetypes when it comes to Formula One drivers, championship level Formula One drivers anyway. So the absolute elite. You're either in a Prost mold where you try and keep yourself out of trouble, you try and be clever about the way that you drive, and you try and do the least you need to do to get the most points that you can possibly get. And often that will mean that you keep your nose out of trouble and live to fight another day. That's kind of the Prost mold. And on the other, there's the Senna mold, which is that you have to be the absolute fastest in every session. Any sign of weakness is just too much weakness. It means you're going to lose, and it means that uh, you can't back out of moves. You'll go for moves that aren't always on. You will defend with your absolute life. And it will often be a little bit marginal and sometimes a bit over the line, but it's paired with absolutely scintillating pace. And if you had to say which one of those two camps Max falls into, you kind of have to say he's a Senna-like driver, isn't he? But that then comes with its own issues, and perhaps the bias that we keep hearing about, the British bias, isn't so much a British bias, but it's a bias against that style of Formula One driver. What do you think?
So, I mean, what you're describing is what psychology sort of describes as a type A and a type B personality, right? That's sort of what we're dealing with here. And both ways can have led to success, and can lead to success, and can lead to failure too, right? I mean, so this is not unique to Formula One or Max either. I mean, this is part of sport, right? You try to do the best you can, and the way to do it is by being the fastest, quickest, strongest, whatever. Or on the other hand, you try to weaken your opponent by where you kind of get there without having to, sort of shed too much of your own energy and whatnot. So that's kind of what we're dealing with here, right? So my first thought is, what's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with it, right?
No,
Yeah,
no, it's
it is.
it's it's just horses for courses ultimately, isn't
Correct.
it? And
Yeah.
everyone's going to kind of prefer one style of driving to the other. But when it comes to go on.
Let me push back because you did
Mm,
sort of bring up the bias thing, right?
mm.
The bias thing comes because of the opponent, right? It's not and it's intertwined, and I will admit it's slightly unfair when and let's sort of step back a second. I have been critical about British bias in the way the sport is covered and beamed to a global audience. I've not been so bothered by it in the way that refereeing and stewarding works. I mean, Formula One has a stewarding problem, but I think that's sort of synonymous with the sport. And frankly, every sport has that, right? There's not a moment that goes by in any sport. I'm sure the ones that you watch over there and the one that I watch here, there's always a controversy every weekend, if not, every single time two teams play. So I think this is sort of part and the fabric of sport in general too. So I wouldn't say that the bias has been there in terms of refereeing and stewarding. I would say the bias has been there because you've had two British drivers, one recently in the form of Lando Norris, and then in 21, infamously Lewis Hamilton. So I think it's interesting. I also think there's again this sort of thread that we cannot ignore. Max races everyone a certain way, but for one guy where he knows that guy can go toe to toe with him and play his game on him too. So there's a little bit of that. I say all
George Russell.
to say
Yeah,
that,
you're right.
huh? Say.
George Russell, yeah.
George Russell, yeah, of course. No, of course, it would be George Russell because he is that good. It is Charles Leclerc, by the way, for avoidance of doubt. And I think that this is sort of where we're at, right? I don't necessarily have, and we've established it's not a problematic thing, except for what this past weekend looked like, and to a certain extent, Austin too, right? Where it just, I think the problem that we have right now, if there is any, if I may take your side for a second, is that kind of driving, where you're just essentially sort of my way or highway kind of thing, works to a certain extent, right? And then you have to kind of draw the line, and that's really hard to do in the heat of battle, where these guys are having to react to split second moves and things like that. So I think that in this past race, Max sort of lost sight of what that line was, and maybe he was just upset. And I don't blame him for any of that. I also don't blame the stewards for penalizing him a certain way. I wouldn't want, by the way, his driving style to be legislated out of the sport. Like that's not something I'm down for. You sort of take every incident at its worth and make the decision and sort of move on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's definitely a style of driving, and it's one that's been used effectively in the three examples that I've said. But if you're gonna, because each of those three drivers at one point or another have complained about bias against them, right? So Senna complained about Jean-Marie Balestre, and the fact that he was a Frenchman in the role of FISA president. And he always sided with Alain Prost, and there's a good argument to say that that was actually true, especially in 1989, for example. Um, Schumacher, again, I don't think he necessarily complained about it himself, but in the British media, he was often cast to be a villain. But that wasn't always he wasn't always driving against a British opponent. But even then, he was cast as the villain, um, often because of his driving. So, Jacques Villeneuve, the punt off in Jerez, Jacques is not a British driver. The Rascasse moment in 2006, again, rightly criticised. His title rival that year was Fernando Alonso, not a British driver. So I don't think it's the British bias there. It's not a bias against that person because they're driving against a British opponent. Damon Hill is the one that everyone's going to bring up, but he wasn't the only rival that Michael had. And similarly with Max, it just so happens that the last two drivers he's been up against have been Lewis and Lando. But I think that the consistency here, the through line is that the style of driving, the style of incidents that happen around that style of driving will always invite a bit of controversy, whether that's right or wrong, whether it's within the rules or outside the rules. And these drivers, the part of their genius is forcing the powers that be to put a microscope over where that line is. And sometimes they're the right side of it, and
Yeah, sometimes you're gonna get
they're fine. Or sometimes the rules have to be changed for them to make what they're doing not fine because clearly moving in the braking zone wasn't fine. Doing the Schumacher chop or the second move in the braking zone was also not fine. These are all things that needed to be changed because they hadn't been tested before. Those were rules that hadn't been tested before, and that's a testament to how far these guys are willing to push. But the flip side to all of this is that you end up with a lot of moments where you think, I know what is going to happen when X driver tries to overtake or tries to defend against Verstappen, Schumacher, or Senna, right? In a give or take moment. And it is give or take moments, and we need to make that clear. The reason that he doesn't drive Carlos Sainz, for example, the same way that he drives Lando Norris, or the reason that he was happy to not fight George Russell in Baku last year is because they're not a threat to his championship ambitions, right? Whereas in 2021, Lewis was, and in 2024, Lando is, in the same way that in 1994, Damon Hill was was a threat to Michael Schumacher's championship ambitions, and Jacques Villeneuve was also in 1997, and Prost was in Senna for Senna in 89 and 90. You can go backwards and you go on and on and on, but the through lines are always there. And I don't have a problem with it. You know that it's not the style of driving that I like. I'm much more of a Prost fan. We've established this through many hours of channel talking,
Mm.
but that's not to say that the way that these guys drive is not a legitimate way to do it, but it does invite much more conversation and much more controversy, and hence accusations of bias, I think.
Yeah, it's also not hard to see why all of these drivers have felt a bit persecuted. I mean, look, this is where the media narrative and the actual sort of on-track stuff gets mixed up, right? And this wasn't quite the case when Senna and Prost were racing, or even at Michael Schumacher's time. But in this day and age, where we are all consuming content from left, right, center, where social media is as active as it just becomes a little bit more sharp. It becomes a little bit more pronounced, and it probably hurts a little bit more both ways, right? I can see both parties feeling like they're done in badly by everything that's happening. So I'm not surprised to see that Max feels a bit persecuted. I mean, he says stuff like, I mean, even Alonso said that, right? You have to be the right citizen to sort of make mistakes or whatever, like those kind of things, right? And I think it's a bit extreme, but it's also their way to play defense in sort of the larger political scope of what does too. So
You're talking about deflection, Ammar. Please
well,
elaborate.
it's not that. It can also be that I made a mistake, but I mean, they might think that I made a mistake, but I feel like I get penalized a little bit more than anyone else. And I can also see the argument that, rule changes, as you're suggesting, can get to a point where, again, you don't know what the impact of that will be. Like these rules, again, like you've stated before, and you've given us sort of a history of, it was there in 21, and then it went away in 22, and then now it's sort of back. And but I mean, for me, it's not even any of that. Like some of these are just common sense stuff. Like, yeah, you can defend, but don't push your opponent off track. Like, I don't know that it require. I don't know that everything requires legislation, right? Because I mean, you have to be in your grid box at the start. If you're
Yeah,
away
okay.
from it, it's like.
But then Amar, I would argue that that's the whole point, right? Is that drivers like Senna and Schumacher and Verstappen are purposefully pushing that boundary so that you have to make rules,
So just no, you don't have to make
because
rules.
they're doing stuff that is that using your words, the eye test is unacceptable, right? Like
But that's why you
moving
have
late in the
supercharge.
braking zone is was unacceptable before
It's
2016,
it's not
but
the
it was allowed within the rules. So how do you then stamp it out unless you're going to say you
It's
cannot do
not
that?
fully allowed within the rules, Shez. The rules don't allow for you to drive another driver off track. Like, I mean, and these are sort of nuanced, complex things. But I mean, common sense is sometimes just that. Like, and I mean, this is why I kind of keep going back to you have to have the stewarding apparatus set to where the people that make those decisions, whether it's a team, whether it's an individual, whoever they are, can apply common sense sort of logic to applying rules. And where they don't exist, they can do that. Like I'm sure there's not a rule for everything. If a driver does some form of unsportsmanlike
Hmm.
conduct, there's probably a generic rule for that. But what defines unsportsmanlike, right? And I'm not suggesting in this case the maneuvers are
Yeah.
sort of
No, I
using
don't think
it
I
as an
don't
example.
yeah.
Like
At no point do I think that Max is being unsporting, other than that turn
right,
seven move
exactly.
in
But my
Mexico, right?
point is, you don't
That
you
that's
don't
not
have
what
to,
we're
right?
saying.
For example, you don't have to tell drivers that they need to dress up to get in a car. Like so you trying to say that like you don't need to do that. Like
Yeah.
some of
No,
this is common sense.
I get that, but when you're doing something, I keep coming back to moving in the braking zone because it's an easy one to understand, right? But Schumacher did it, Max was doing it as well, and it's clearly not something that should be allowed to
The
happen.
safety issue.
Correct, but there wasn't any apparatus in the rules to prevent it, and therefore they weren't getting penalized for it. So
Yeah.
at some point that has to happen, doesn't it? So that's the genius of driving like that, is that because you're pushing to that extreme, because you're hyper competitive. That I still hate that argument. It seems to suggest that nobody else on the grid is competitive, only your driver,
All
and
20 of
therefore,
those are hyper
yeah,
competitive.
exactly. Well, apart from Lance Stroll, he's not competitive.
He's just chilling.
Yeah, sorry, mate. Um, but anyway, but the act of pushing that far forces the governing body, the rule makers, to have to change the rules. And then I do want to talk a bit about deflection, because I do think that that is part of this. The whole narrative that the world is against me is also not new, right? Um, Senna had this. It's a kind of mentality, right? And if you haven't read it, there's a really good article on motorsportmagazine.com by Mark Hughes. It came out a couple of weeks ago. It was talking about Michael Schumacher, the good, the not so good, and the conclusion. And one of the things that he talks about there is he talks about the three giants of Formula One in the last sort of 30 years or so. And those are Senna, Schumacher, and Hamilton, and how their mentality dictates a little bit of how they drive. So Senna was very much I am the fastest, I am the king of the track, so everybody needs to move out of the way for me. That's why he would go for gaps that weren't really gaps. That's why he would defend positions the way he did. That's why so he felt so justified in himself to exact retribution on Alain Prost in 1990 because of what he felt had happened in 1989.
Right.
It's I am the king. I deserve to be I deserve to be respected, and there was that's all wrapped up in the whole I'm an outsider, people don't like me, so I have to drive like this. That was the facade, but the ultimate belief was I am the king of the track. Whereas Schumacher was much more, because it's Mark Hughes' words, but if you read it, you'll see where this is coming from. With Michael, it was much more a case of a slight insecurity in himself that he wasn't the fastest, even though he was quite clearly the fastest, and that's what drove him to be the fittest guy on the track, and put in the most hours at Fiorano after hours. But it also meant that if he was worried that Alonso was going to get pole, he was going to park it in the wall at Rascas to stop him from doing it. Now, I don't know where Max's mentality comes in at the moment. I don't think he falls into either of those two archetypes, or either of those two mentalities. I think he has an inner strength that he understands what his level is, and he's just pushing the boundaries. I think he's just smart. But that mentality, that deflection, is still there within him as well. That whole I've done something and have been penalized for it, but it's not my fault. I've been unfairly penalized for it. You know,
So I see what you're saying, but I am reluctant to discount how someone feels when they come to the sport a certain way that they do.
mm,
And
okay,
it can be said about Lewis as well, right? Because
yeah.
he's the only person of color on grid, and I don't remember if anyone else was. Maybe there were a couple people, but I
It
mean,
depends what you mean by person of color, because
yeah, I mean, sure, a
we
black,
had,
just say
yeah,
that first.
right, because Kareem Chandhok and Narain Karthikeyan both drove in Formula One as
Sure,
well,
right. I agree with this. So I
and
should.
Alex Albon would probably argue that he is too.
Right. And so that's that so I'm just not I get it. Look, this is also an athlete's mentality, right? To put a chip on their shoulder, to prove everyone else wrong, whether it's real or not. The in the NFL, I don't know if you heard about the great Tom Brady, but that's kind of what he used to do. He used to put clippings of newspapers where everything that reminded him of him being less than, right? Or anyone who wrote something about him kind of doing that. And this is legendary. I mean, even Michael Jordan did stuff like so I'm not too bothered by that, right? Because that's how athletes feel. And if that gets them going, that gets them go to another level, that's completely fine. I mean, just look at how
Yeah,
we
yeah,
saw
yeah, yeah.
Senna now. Yeah,
Yeah, for full clarity, I'm not saying I have a problem with it, but I'm just trying to understand where that
that's the
me
main
against the world mentality comes from. I think it is just part of that
point.
whole I've worked my butt off to get where I am. I deserve some respect, or perhaps I think someone's faster than me, but I'm going to do whatever I can to be the best. And when someone criticizes me
But
for something that I think was completely right, like Schumacher was legendary for never thinking he was wrong. He punted Villeneuve off the track at Jerez in '97 and walked back to the pits. And the first words he said to Ross Brawn were, "What the hell was he thinking?" That's what he thought,
yeah,
right? But
I
and
mean,
there is a competitive winner's mentality in that you can admire, but it does then lead to this kind of um, view in the media and within fans, I think, where you come across as being a bit aloof.
yeah, but I mean, I think this is also, again, it's a reflection on society in general, right? Like, I mean, that's going to happen, right? I mean, what do we say about Lando? You've been on here criticizing him, saying time and time again, he needs to go out and get it, right? And then what do we tell about Max? Well, he needs to tone it down a little bit. And I'm not saying this is exactly your part,
I'm
but
not saying that. I'm
but
not
I'm not
saying
saying
he
those are
has
your
to tone
words,
it
but I think
down.
the sentiment is just that, right? Like I think in a perfect world, we'd have Lando step up in being a little bit more selfish and greedy and all of that, and in a perfect world, we'd have Max just take that slight step backward so he doesn't cross the line, so to speak. I don't think you can ever get that, and I think that's the beauty of this season. I'll also add that Max is, driving the way he is right now, and he's frustrated not necessarily because of the stewarding, although it does come out in that way, but he knows that he has a card that cannot compete on
Yeah,
paper.
yeah,
He's
yeah.
got no
Oh, yeah,
shot at it. So
yeah,
he's going to have
yeah,
to
yeah,
do
yeah,
everything he can. And
yeah.
I think sometimes when you're just that desperate, and again, in the heat of battle, you're going to do everything you can. So again, I thought the Mexico move was fairly well calculated. Like,
Which one?
of course, I
Which
mean, the
one?
one where he just sort of dive bombed, right, Lando? It's like, okay,
Yeah.
if we both crash out, this is even better for me, right? And so that's the beauty of where he's at too, right? Um,
But that then exposes a bit of a hole in the stewarding as well, right?
Correct. That's why I
Because
come back to we have to, yeah.
but not just in terms of whether he gets a penalty or not, but it's what that penalty is. Because if you want to deter somebody from doing something like that, and he's being smart enough that he knows what the penalty is for doing something like that, it's going to be a 10-second penalty. But if you know, the FIA in '97 stripped Michael Schumacher of all his points that year. Now, if I'm not saying that's, I'm definitely not saying that's what should have happened in Mexico. But
Well,
if, for example, he got a one race ban for doing something like that, well, then it
Shez,
changes his mentality a little bit, doesn't
just
it?
play with me over here. Let's say in
Mm.
that move, Lando does not take, avoiding action and they do crash. What do you think the penalty is then? What do you think a fair penalty for Max is? Do they
But I
take
can't
away
tell you what I
points?
think.
Do
No,
they do
I can't tell
away?
you what I think a fair penalty is, but I
I
can
mean,
tell you
because
what the penalty would have been, which would have been another 10-second penalty. It's what
so,
Lewis got in Silverstone in 2021.
so there you
Because,
go. There you go. That's a great. And so even if Max got a 30-second penalty, maybe
but
even a
the
50-second penalty, let's just
but
say
there has to be some assessment of the intention there, and that's the problem, right?
that's the
That's the
problem.
problem with this is that I can't sit here and tell you that this is what Max definitely thought when he made that dive bomb. I can make an assumption, and I know also from listening to what he said afterwards that he kind of knew what he was doing there.
Yeah, there you
But
go.
in the moment, a steward can't look in his helmet,
No, but
read
if
his
you
mind, and say this is why he did it. So yeah, it's difficult to
Just
make that.
this is why I keep coming back to you cannot dole out punishments equally. It has to be equitable, right? Which is if Max is saying this and he doesn't sound like he sounds like he was fine with it. Like he barely even got upset with it. So uh, if you have to bring the human element into this, and I realize that it brings in some level of subjectivity, so that's only going to create more division, more angst, depending on what camp you're on, right? But that's just kind of what this is now. I mean, look, the precedent is set now, right? So like he got the 10-second now. What if this happens again in Brazil, where maybe he takes out Lando? What do we do now? Because I feel like sooner or later, in what is remaining of the season, we're going to have to cross that bridge. It seems because this is not what you're seeing from Max is not just backing up his opponent into someone else, like a la Lewis Hamilton was trying, for a little bit there, but with Nico Rosberg. But this is a little bit more serious than that, right? Because he's desperate. And to lose this championship, we haven't discussed this enough. I mean, think about the mentality that we just talked about with Max and sort of aligning him with Senna and Schumacher. If he loses this title, just imagine the fear of that. And I think that's driving him more than even sort of the outsider persecution complex. I think it's just that, like knowing that this championship could go out of his hands. And he has been fairly lucky that Lando hasn't been on his A game yet. But and there are
Yeah.
plenty of points to come.
I think
So
this might be his A game. That's the problem.
yeah, so there's that. But
Yeah, yeah, I think it's an interesting one, but I keep coming back to this point that that this lineage isn't new, right?
no,
There's this kind of it's it's bordering on desperation, and I get that. Um, in that I have to win the championship, and maybe that's it. Maybe you're right. Maybe you've hit the nail on the head. That actually that's where his mentality is. That I've got a
or not
slower car
losing
because
this year,
he's
by the way.
yeah, correct. He's talked about it enough, hasn't he? That actually the main problem isn't that I'm getting penalties. It's the fact that my car isn't quick enough on race day, and therefore I am having to do these things. I don't want to do them, but I'm having to do them. I remember back in Mexico 2020, maybe when he won the race there. He said, "This is what I want all races to be like. I just want to be able to start from the front and waltz off into the distance." It's a
Right.
very Michael
Exactly.
Schumacher trait as well. That he just, his skill was in being able to drive that car faster than anybody else. But as soon as he hit, not hit, as soon as he had to engage in a wheel to wheel battle, things got a bit messy. And perhaps
Yeah. I mean,
perhaps Max admits to that as well. That actually what he wants is to be able to lead from the front and not get engaged in battles with his rivals. Um,
and the problem
and
has been that he
that's
hasn't
what
been
leads
tested
to
the last couple of years. He has just simply not been. I mean, there was sort of a portion in 2022 for a little bit, right, where he was getting pushed a little bit, but he hasn't been pushed this way, and it's tantalizingly close, right? I mean, again, you cannot discount the idea of if you're Max Verstappen and you're staring down what these next few races like.
fully
They're all
understandable.
McLaren
Yeah,
hunting
yeah,
grounds essentially, right? Like, I mean, there's probably a Ferrari track in there, but even that doesn't help him. By the way, there's not a track there where you would, and Red Bull just don't have anything, and he knows that, and they know that. So all they have to do is defend. So I can envision more battles where he's driving Lando off the track because that's all
yeah,
he's got at his arsenal. And of
yeah.
course that can happen, Shez. Even if he gets a ban at that point, whatever, you're going to lose the championship anyway. If that's, I mean, again, if
Yeah,
you're thinking that, it's like, what difference does it make? Which is what these
yeah.
leagues are all
And
about. So,
I guess I'll finish with this. Desperation, it becomes apparent in different ways in different drivers. I totally agree with that. And this is just what I think we're seeing from Max. And again, I'm not saying it's a bad
fascinating.
thing. It's a trait that he has inherited, you know, by watching or experience from his forefathers, Senna and Schumacher. I can't put it any more aptly than that, I don't think. Anyway, on that bombshell, I think we should probably end it. Uh, as usual, please like. If you haven't, please subscribe. We are tantalizingly close to getting 901 subscribers. It would be awesome if we could. Uh, pl- please leave us a comment. We'll read all of them and we'll reply to as many as we possibly can. And we will see you guys in the next one.
Later.